Is aging a disease? Whether the answer is a yes or a no, the impact for society is likely to be a major one. If yes, then healthcare systems should endorse the responsibility for treating all consequences of aging, and we should be ready to judge that the elderly are ipso facto sick, be it only of having wrinkles, being bald, or not reaching the maximum level of athletic performance they may have reached in the past. But if aging is not a disease, multiple questions should be raised about the medicalization of conditions that may, to some extent, be a part of aging, like the loss of muscular mass, dementia, metabolic disorders, atherosclerosis, or even some forms of cancer. All this suggests that the question, is aging a disease, certainly runs too deep for medicine alone to answer it. An answer heavily depends on what is meant by aging and by disease. As specialists of meaning analysis, philosophers of medicine have proposed such an analysis of these two concepts. A reason why medicine alone is not to be trusted when it comes to the question, is aging a disease, has been put forward by philosopher H.T. Engelhardt in a 1977 paper. Research aimed at postponing aging, he says, automatically turns aging into a disease process, a process to be treated and controlled by medicine. The same argument is true for all the disabilities associated with aging. The result is that an undetermined part of aging, maybe all of it, thus becomes what he calls unpostponed but postponable aging. And this, he says, is inevitably considered as a disease. A first clarification of the situation comes with the distinction between being old, that is, having lived a good number of years, and being aged, that is, being compromised in vigor and ability. Medicine is looking not simply for an increase in life expectancy, being more and more aged, but for an increase in the span of useful, vigorous life, that is, living older without becoming aged. This is precisely what inadvertently turns aging into a disease process, a process to be treated and controlled by medicine. We diagnose and treat the conditions of the aged because we feel that we have, or ought to have, some control over anything that makes our lives less useful or vigorous. Yet, this also inherently leads to an increase in lifespan. Treating the condition of the aged is indeed the humane thing to do. In other terms, it is natural to medicalize aging, but common sense is protesting against pathologizing aging. This is the implicit argument Kaplan, 1977, has examined. Why do we think that aging should not be medically treated, that is, prevented or stopped, just as a pathological condition should be? According to Kaplan, this is based on our belief that aging is natural. Natural means familiar, universal, normal, and inevitable. But this belief is mistaken. Some diseases are, and many could happen to be, familiar, universal, normal, and inevitable. There would still be diseases. Another line of argument is that aging is the natural order of things, and that it has some hidden utility. If evolution has not eliminated aging, the argument goes, it is certainly because it has some deep function, if not for the individual, at least for the species, like ensuring the renewal of the species. However, the recent development of evolutionary biology has dismissed these views. First, there is nothing, such as an intrinsic process of death that would be necessary to renew the species. Extrinsic causes of death are sufficient to do that. Besides, the classical view of aging in evolutionary biology is rather that aging is not the product of natural selection, but rather the byproduct of the relative weakness of natural selection when it comes to the elimination of late deleterious genes. More on this in the module on metawar in this course. Moreover, Kaplan lists several properties of disease that all fit a description of aging as well. Number 1, it produces discomfort or suffering. Number 2, it can be traced back to a specific cause, event, or circumstance. Number 3, a set of clear-cut structural changes are involved. Number 4, aging involves a set of clinical symptoms or manifestations. Number 5, it also involves some sort of functional impairment in the functions, behavior, or activity of a person. If aging as well has all these properties, then aging must certainly be considered a disease too. It is no more or no less natural than disease is, and there is no reason not to treat aging as a disease in all regards. The first criterion for something to be a disease, as proposed by Kaplan, was it produces discomfort or suffering, which echoed Engelhardt's unnamed opposite to what he calls a useful, vigorous life. That kind of criterion is not biological or factual in any scientific sense. It is more cultural or even moral. Thus, Murphy, in a 1986 paper, proposes that instead of asking, "Is aging a disease?" a better question would be, "Is aging objectionable?" such that its prevention and cure ought to be sought. In fact, Kaplan's point was not to establish that aging is a disease because it is not natural. His point was rather that there is no reason to treat aging and disease differently based on the alleged fact that one is natural while the other is not. But, says Murphy, no argument from nature can establish that aging should or should not be the object of medical attention or medical care. Disease is no less natural than aging. If aging had an evolutionary adaptive function, this would be no argument against the objectionability of aging. Moreover, even if aging was not a disease, this would not be a reason not to attend to it. There actually is only one criterion to decide whether it is desirable to cure or prevent aging. Would it add to or detract from the significance of human life? The goal of an intervention against aging matters much more to an answer than the nature of the process of aging. Is it the shortness of life? Is it the weaknesses of age? The answer might be different. Murphy's conclusion is that the cure of aging would have to be sought primarily for reasons of morally defined well-being. In the end, as Schramme in a 2013 paper summarizes, there are two separate questions. One is theoretical. Is aging a disease? The other is normative. Should we eradicate aging? The theoretical question should not be, as Kaplan phrased it, is aging natural? But rather, is aging a dysfunction? Indeed, dysfunction is the main criterion of disease in contemporary medicine, not unnaturalness. Dysfunction is the inability to produce an expected effect that is statistically normal for an individual of a certain species, age, and sex. A distinction can be made between declining level of deficiency, say walking speed, and disappearance or breakdown of function, say the appearance of cancer. Both are age-related. While the latter is a disease, the former is not. The normative question is different. First, we may want to treat conditions of the aged without considering them to be diseases or even dysfunctions. Second, in a liberal society, no strong reason should be opposed to those who may want to pursue a treatment against aging, while no obligation should be imposed on those who do not want to resort to it. These philosophical reflections are relevant. However, they fail to provide health policy, governance, or research funding with more than a very limited contribution. The first reason is that they mainly focus on whether anti-aging interventions would be good, without any examination of whether they are simply doable. The second is that they rely only on surface properties of aging and disease. Indeed, the question, should we treat aging, has so far always been asked in such a way as to ignore what is known about the mechanisms of aging and anti-aging interventions, and to focus on what the consequences are, or would be, of such a practice, mainly on our representations of aging and disease, or on our lives. Typically, I do not mean to discuss particular means of curing aging, such as the arrest of protein degradation. Rather, what I want to do is to raise moral issues involved with supposing there is a cure to aging. This actually makes the argument very weak. Either the philosopher wants to claim something precise and has to rely on alleged properties of anti-aging interventions without critical examination, or the philosopher wants to avoid any presupposition on its effects and remains at a very general and abstract level. An example of the former case is when Schramme seems to assume, without an investigation of the biogerontology literature, that interventions on telomeres and free radicals would induce a longer but not a healthier life. Recent research is often related to the extension of chronological age, e.g. by focusing on telomeres or free radicals. But what would be the point in living a longer life if we were not healthy? An example of the latter case is when philosophers discuss immortality simply as a sort of moral exercise. Examples can be found in Bernard Williams' paper, an analysis of a character in a play, Macropoulos, who has become immortal thanks to an elixir, and in related philosophical discussions. This is interesting, but basically void of practical interest. If very remote from the form that anti-aging intervention would actually take and the results that would actually obtain. In other cases, the discussion is misled by approximative or erroneous understanding of the science. For instance, the philosopher Temkin sounds very naive in biogerontology just by claiming that Rose and de Grey are first-rate scientists with major ongoing research programs. If they are right, we are not required biologically to die of old age. To anyone with some knowledge of the field, the two research programs are not at all on a par. Even though the popular science books both have written sound alike. One of them is an evolutionary biologist with a solid recognition in population genetics and a track record on aging in populations of Drosophila. The other one is a very famous figure in anti-aging research, with very bold plans for drastic engineering of the human biology to achieve the goal of immortality. More on this in the module about the SENSE program. To answer the question, is aging a disease, philosophers of medicine have mainly used a traditional lexical and logical method. What they did is they tried to A. Make the meaning of the terms aging and disease as precise as possible, and B. Determine what the more consensual properties are. Then C. Investigate whether, based upon this clarified meaning of terms, it logically follows that aging is, or is not, a disease, or that it should, or should not, be treated. For instance, based on an analysis of the meaning of natural, Kaplan concludes that if aging was natural and disease unnatural, then aging could not be a disease. Given that aging is as unnatural as disease, aging can be considered a disease. Engelhardt draws the same inference based on an analysis of the property ought to be treated. Murphy, from an analysis or based on an analysis of the property of being objectionable and tractable. Schramme, based on dysfunction. De Winter, based on reduction of functional ability and capacity to cope with change. For instance, Schramme writes, if all diseases are dysfunctions and if aging is not a dysfunction, aging is not a disease. But if all dysfunctional aspects of aging are age-related diseases, then the part of aging consisting in age-related diseases, and only this part, is diseases. More specifically, the problem is not with the search for logical consistency. Philosophers are right to check for that. The problem is rather with the pivotal features these philosophers use as defining implicit assumptions or vernacular beliefs about aging and disease, natural, treatable, etc., rather than scientifically defined properties like accumulation of senescent cells, inflammaging, loss of proteostasis, etc. Moreover, each time a philosopher of medicine mentions a more specific scientifically defined property of aging, it is not as a replacement of its vaguer common sense counterpart, but rather to illustrate and confirm the analysis of the latter. For instance, Kaplan mentions chromosomal aberrations, fewer organelles, increasingly rigid and inflexible collagen fibers, and weakening of the immune system, only to draw the conclusion that changes of this kind are universal and inevitable. Or he mentions the evolutionary theory of aging only to draw the conclusion that aging is not natural in the sense that it is not the production of evolution by natural selection. In summary, philosophers of medicine have mostly sought for a stance whence they can put the details of aging mechanisms aside in order to discuss the question. The result is not a superficial analysis, but it sure is an analysis of the surface arguments in this field. But as the rest of this course will show, there is much more a philosopher of science can propose in discussing basic concepts and results of aging research.